Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A very good evening. Donald Trump insists it was mission accomplished. In a series of tweets lambasting his opponents, the president has blamed criticism of his language over the Syria Air Strikes as typical of the fake news media. But while military action appears to be over, the diplomatic pressure continues, with the US representative to the United Nations warning Russia of fresh sanctions to come. Sky's Hannah Thomas-Peter has the latest for us from Washington.
Protests in America over strikes in Syria as the questions continue on what justified the military action. The Trump administration clear on the moral case and its cover under US law, but less so on the international legal argument.
The United States has authority under Article 2 of our Constitution for the president to act in the best interests of the United States and in the interests of our U.S. forces. So the United States did that under that, and that is what we support. Look, I'm not an expert in international law. I'm not going to say that I am here, but I am confident in the U.S. and its allies in its decision to do this, to take out those chemical weapons facilities, and I'd be happy to argue that with anyone who takes issue with our decision.
The president is engaged in a different debate, defending his use of mission accomplished as such a great military term. His own officials, however, clear that the mission may not be over.
If Assad continues to go forward, there will be more, and it will hurt. And I think that he has a lot to think about.
Meanwhile, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad met Russian politicians. Neither country has retaliated against the limited strikes, but feel they were an act of aggression. With chemical weapons inspectors in Damascus, amidst all the recriminations, even the Pope has commented.
I'm deeply upset by the current world situation. Despite the instruments available to the international community, there's a struggle to agree a common action in favor of peace in Syria and in other regions of the world. As I pray for peace, I invite all people of goodwill to keep doing the same. I appeal one more time to all the politicians in charge so that justice and peace can prevail.
Politically, it would suit Donald Trump to avoid being drawn further into the Syrian conflict. It's not long until the midterm elections, where Republican control of Congress may be at stake. In part, the president was propelled to power by promising to avoid foreign wars. It's a crucial issue to his core supporters. And so pictures of US military might being deployed thousands of miles away will not be playing well in the American heartland. Trump's next move on Syria may well be calculated with this in mind. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News in Washington.
In just a moment's time, we'll be live in Moscow with our correspondent Diana Magne. First to Hannah, who's in Washington for us. What's happening in the next few days diplomatically, Hannah?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there appears to be a return to the mechanisms that were abandoned in frustration by America. They turned away from the United Nations and away from diplomacy in favor of military action. Now they are trying again. So we are hearing reports that Washington is preparing fresh sanctions against Syria, although I think there is agreement amongst officials that there will be a kind of limited effect. That might be more of a symbolic gesture. Separately, the UK, the US and France, I am told by Security Council diplomats, have prepared a brand new UN Security Council resolution aimed at irreversibly ending Syria's chemical weapons program. I just asked a couple of diplomats, actually, whether or not this was a genuine good faith attempt to get the consensus that has so far eluded the Council on Syria because of Russia's power to veto. And our diplomats just replied, I'm not sure there's genuine hope that that is the right phrase, but yes, we will negotiate in good faith. Russia was only supported by Bolivia and China yesterday, making it clear that actually there is the potential for consensus on this issue. And what would that achieve? There would be a legally binding resolution international consensus that would make it much less likely that nations would have to form coalitions to use military action. It is by far the best route as far as Donald Trump is concerned, because as I said at the end of my report there, he knows that interfering in foreign conflicts is deeply unpopular with his base.
Interesting. Hannah, thank you. To Moscow and our correspondent Diana Magne. So I suppose, would the Russians be open to that kind of offer in terms of a new resolution put to the UN Security Council? And also they've been speaking to their allies today, Diana.
Russia's not particularly open to many offers that come up within the Security Council. It tends to veto Security Council resolutions that relate to Syria rather than anything else. I think its presence on the P5 has generally been pretty obstructive. But you're right that President Putin has been having conversations with his Iranian counterpart. They discussed the strikes. They said that any further strikes would bring chaos to the international system. But I think for all President Putin's grand words of outrage about this strike, I think he's actually quite pleased with the outcome, because to a certain extent, Russia's bases were respected, Russia's red lines were respected. The status quo, where Russia is the major power broker in Syria, was respected by this extremely limited strike. And I think Russia feels now that it has full leeway to discuss with the other major regional power broker, i.e. Iran, a future for this country. And I think it's also telling that Duma representatives, parliamentarians from Russia, met today with the Syrian president, talked about divvying up the country into Russian hands when peace is finally achieved.
OK, Diana, Hannah, thank you. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has questioned the legality of this weekend's joint airstrikes against the Syrian regime, and he's calling for new laws to ensure that the UK cannot go to war without the prior approval of Parliament. The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson defended the case for British action in Syria today, saying the UK had a duty to show Syria had not got away with using chemical weapons. Our senior political correspondent Jason Farrell reports.
The ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285.
In 2013, this vote paralysed plans to punish Assad for using chemical weapons.
I strongly believe in the need for a tough response to the use of chemical weapons, but I also believe in respecting the will of this House of Commons.
Where is that respect now? Theresa May has bypassed the House. Now she has to explain her actions. Since that vote 5 years ago, Parliament has sanctioned action against Daesh in Syria, but not against the regime.
For the role of UK armed forces to be changed without the approval of Parliament, I think is a serious mistake, and I hope that we see over the next 24, 48 hours a full debate in the House of Commons, not just a statement by the Prime Minister, and a commitment that if there was to be any further action, that has to be authorised and sanctioned by a vote in the House of Commons.
Today, the Foreign Secretary has been defending the government's actions.
We hope that that has degraded his capability, but at the very least what it has done is sent a signal that the world won't tolerate the continual erosion of the taboo against chemical weapons.
The government says its legal justification for deploying these jets to strike was based on the need to alleviate humanitarian suffering, that there was no other course of action available, and that the action was proportionate. But that hasn't convinced Jeremy Corbyn.
The humanitarian intervention is a legally debatable concept at the present time, and I would have thought from the point of recalling Parliament or waiting 2 days, things could have been different. But it looked awfully to me as though the Prime Minister was more interested in following Donald Trump's lead than anything else. And this is policy made up by Twitter.
Throughout history, Prime Ministers have always had the power to order military action without parliamentary approval, although more recently it's become convention to consult Parliament. And Jeremy Corbyn wants to introduce a War Powers Act to oblige Prime Ministers to do so. An idea first proposed by Gordon Brown,
but never introduced.
Opposition MPs also say they want a full parliamentary debate and vote on the airstrikes, not just a statement from the Prime Minister. Spring in Westminster is already heating up. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
We're going to be speaking to our diplomatic editor, Dominic Waghorn, very shortly about what happens next after these strikes. First, we're getting some breaking news out of Westminster. Let's speak to Jason Farrell. Jason, concerns what we might see taking place in Parliament in the next few days. What's happening?
Well, we understand Julian Smith has sent out an email to all the Conservative MPs. He's the chief whip for the Conservatives, saying that there will be a three-line whip on Tuesday. Now, what does this mean? It means that the Conservatives anticipate that there would be an important vote in the House of Commons on Tuesday afternoon. He says, please be advised that the whip on Tuesday will now be a three-line whip. All colleagues should be on the estate, i.e. the Westminster estate, and available. No real explanation for it, but I think we can all make guesses. Now, either the government is anticipating that will be an urgent question that will be granted by the Speaker, and that would lead to an urgent debate in the House of Commons the next day on Tuesday, or here's the alternative, is that the government has decided that they would like to frame the debate, they'd frame the question and put the debate on Tuesday. So either way, it's quite interesting. Another thing that we've also learned quite recently is that the SNP have said that they would back Jeremy Corbyn's idea of this War Powers Act. So things, yes, heating up here in Parliament. It's shaping up for an interesting week.
Jason, thank you. OK, let's speak to Dominic, our diplomatic editor. We've had the airstrikes. Are we rowing back now from what we saw last week? People were talking about World War III. Are we at a more settled point now?
Well, they're certainly more limited than some people thought or feared, possibly. And what I think we're now entering is a period of no more military action for now. But if Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons again, America and Britain have threatened that more military action will follow. Now, the difficulty with that is a year ago, Donald Trump ordered airstrikes against the airfield that he thought was used to strike Khan Shaykhun with sarin gas. It took 4 to 5 days before the Syrians were able to get that runway back up and running and start using it again. And incrementally, they are alleged to have started testing, using chemical weapons, getting more and more grievous in their use until we ended up with this attack in Douma. So the question for the West is they can threaten to use military force again if chemical weapons are used, but what is their bar? If it's just a bit of chlorine gas that kills or, you know, victims in the single figures, will they launch military action? And what Bashar al-Assad knows is that if he uses the kind of chemical weapons he's alleged to have used in Douma, the response he can get is a limited strike that, as far as we know, only destroyed a few empty buildings.
And was forewarned.
And was forewarned. And because of that, he was able to get his aircraft out of the area to Russian bases into safety, and probably get his sarin-making or other chemical weapons capability, machinery or whatever it is, out of those buildings as well. So as far as we know, this multi-million-dollar sound and light display actually blew up a few empty buildings. So he can choose to use them again. He will face more airstrikes. But if those airstrikes are preceded by the same kind of 4 or 5 days of warning, it's not that much for him to worry about militarily.
Do you think that what Nikki Haley is proposing, fresh sanctions, a new UN resolution, about stopping Syria's chemical weapons programme, if that's put on the table, is this strangely going to have the airstrikes this weekend, is it strangely going to make it more likely we might have agreement? Sorry about that. Important call. Is it more likely that we're going to have agreement around the diplomatic table or not?
That's actually our Europe correspondent who was calling back about the OPCW. Tomorrow, a meeting to discuss Syria. And what we're understanding is there is some kind of effort to try and increase that process of scrutiny about chemical weapons being used. And the OPCW, organisation that should be scrutinising that, they have a team in there already looking or trying to get into Douma to examine what happened there. I think the aim, as you say, is for the West to have a process where Syria can be held to account more. And so it's easier to get the information to verify that chemical weapons have been used, and therefore it's more automatic to use military action to punish it. I think that's still wishful thinking at the moment. And if you're the Syrian leader, you're trying to deal with the problem you have in Douma and also the rebel activity in the west of the country, and you're trying to do it quickly. The more the quicker it goes, the more support you're going to have from your Russian allies. We can't rely on that forever. And chemical weapons do make that task easier for him and quicker. And that's the kind of cold calculation, the calculus that he is operating under at the moment. It's pretty cynical, but he may decide this week that he's got away with it and could calculate that he could get away with it again in future.
OK, Dominic, thank you.
The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has questioned the government's decision to launch airstrikes on Syria, saying that he would only consider taking military action with the backing of the United Nations. The strikes by Britain, the United States and France targeted suspected chemical weapons sites. Today, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said no further action was planned. But he said if the Assad regime used chemical weapons again, the government would study the options. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
British jets have already fired their missiles at Syrian targets, but the political argument continues. The government says the purpose of yesterday's airstrike was clear: to show the use of chemical weapons, whether in Salisbury or Syria, could never be accepted.
There is no proposal on the table at the moment for further attacks because so far, thank heavens, the Assad regime has not been so foolish as to launch another chemical weapons attack.
There would, said Boris Johnson, be no slide into regime change, no UK meddling in Syria's civil war. And showing again how low the UK's relationship with Russia has sunk, Mr Johnson rubbished recent suggestions by Moscow.
To say that either that Britain was involved in what happened in Salisbury, which is blatantly offensive, or that we were somehow involved in what happened in Duma, which is absolutely demented.
But Labour's leader is starkly at odds with the government, opposed to military action against Syria without UN backing.
I can only countenance involvement in Syria if there's a UN authority behind it.
The Russians vetoed UN resolutions on this 6 times now.
There
is no reason to think they'll all stop.
Both sides have either vetoed or threatened to veto. There obviously has not been agreement.
Russia has repeatedly used its UN veto to block sanctions and chemical weapons investigations during the long civil war in Syria. Jeremy Corbyn said weapons inspectors should be allowed to do their work.
Confront Assad with that evidence, confront any other group that may be fingered because of that, I'm saying maybe, I don't know, and then say they must now come in and remove and destroy those weapons.
On the legality of this military action, on the need for a parliamentary vote, the Labour leadership strongly disagrees with the government. A row that will be played out in the Commons tomorrow when Theresa May makes a statement to MPs. Now, the government does have the power to launch military action without having the consent of MPs first, but opposition parties strongly insist that in this instance, Theresa May should not have sidestepped Parliament. Labour wants a new War Powers Act to clarify Parliament's role in sending British forces into combat. The SNP too says convention has been ignored.
There weren't many good things came out of the Iraq war debacle, but one of the things that did was a practice of Parliament authorising military action in all bar the most exceptional circumstances. And I think for this action to have taken place without parliamentary approval is a retrograde step.
The SNP is pushing for a symbolic vote tomorrow, and Theresa May is likely to face tough questions from all sides about her long-term strategy for Syria. Ben Wright, BBC News.
The United States says it's preparing new sanctions against Russia over its support for Syria. The US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said that they would affect companies dealing with chemical weapons equipment. President Putin has warned that any further Western missile strikes against Syria would cause international chaos. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
In Damascus, journalists were allowed to see one of the targets. The Syrians deny it was a complex used to research and develop chemical and biological weapons. In the end, the whole operation was a limited attack, a punishment, and a message that the West won't tolerate the use of chemical weapons. Powerful hardware was used. This was an American B-1 bomber loading up at its base in the United States. No wonder there were fears that the raids could make Syria's war even worse and risk a confrontation with Russia and Iran, the Syrian regime's main allies. But their targets were chosen to avoid hitting them. This was a periscope eye view of a missile being fired from a US submarine. This weekend's winners included those against escalating the war. The Americans want nothing to delay the pullout of US troops who've been in northern Syria fighting jihadist extremists. President Assad's regime was not hit either. His conclusion will be that the US, France and Britain, for all their power, are not prepared to touch him. No wonder he looked relaxed meeting Russian politicians in Damascus. Deya al-Mohammed, his wife al-Noor and their children were caught up in the attack in Douma a week ago. al-Noor and their daughter Master's accounts of what happened seemed to corroborate reports it was a chemical attack. The BBC managed to track them down to the relative safety of a camp in northern Syria.
I saw white smoke like fog. Our legs started to get weak. We started to lose the nerves in our legs. Had a shortness of breath and burning in the nose and chest. There was no oxygen, and we were fighting death to go upstairs and reach the higher floors.
People were dying. Suddenly the civil defense came. They put us on the ground and poured water on us. Then they took us to the medical center, sprayed us, gave us injections. I was fainting. My heart was aching. When we went to sleep, the plane shelled and we were covered in dust. We went back down to the basement and saw how they were bringing in the martyrs. Instead of breathing air, we breathed the smell of blood.
In Douma, the Russian military brought in heavy equipment to start clearing rubble. Another chemical attack might change things, but after the Western rhetoric and raids, this looks like business as usual. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette is in Beirut this evening. Lise, have the airstrikes had an effect on the Syrian regime?
Well, Michelle, there's been defiant scenes on the streets of Damascus with President Assad's supporters chanting against what they called the West's failure, and defiant statements from the president himself, who has said that these missile strikes have only strengthened his determination to crush his opponents. And almost on cue, just hours after those missile strikes, the Syrian army announced it was now in full control of the last rebel enclave on the edge of Damascus, which includes the area where that suspected chemical attack took place a little more than a week ago. So in all of the discussion and debates now about what happens next in Syria, it's clear that on the ground the Syrian military, backed by its Russian and Iranian allies, is going to focus north on the last province, which is still held by the rebels, Idlib, largely controlled by hardline Islamists, including fighters linked to al-Qaeda. So in the months ahead, there is an expectation of more brutal battles, which in Syria means a grave humanitarian disaster.
Lise Doucette in Beirut, thank you.
The Foreign Secretary today defended the legality of the attack on Syria's chemical weapons capacity. Mr. Johnson said there were no proposals on the table for any further attacks, despite the US ambassador to the UN saying American forces stood locked and loaded should Assad offend again. Nikki Haley has also said that the US will tomorrow announce further sanctions against Russia, Syria's key ally. Here, Labour made it clear the Prime Minister will face a barrage of criticism in the Commons tomorrow about the legality of those Syrian attacks. More from our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan.
In the Mediterranean Sea in the early hours of Saturday, a cruise missile is launched from the US submarine, the John Warner. These are the latest images of the airstrikes against Syria. Today, the Foreign Secretary was defending the decision to join in those strikes before hearing from Parliament.
Obviously, our prime consideration has to be the safety of our serving men and women, and of course the effectiveness and speed of the operation. And there's plenty of precedent for getting it done in this way.
It's only a few months since the Prime Minister herself visited RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, from where Tornado jets flew their sorties. Labour say the Prime Minister should have consulted Parliament before rushing to act with the Americans.
Circumstances like now, where they feel that they have to go now, before Congress sits, before Parliament sits, that was part of the reason why they had to go so quickly, because they did not want to be accountable to the elected representatives of America and the elected representatives of the UK, and that's not right.
New satellite images show two buildings near Homs before the airstrikes and after. This looks like a successful attack. Images of a site nearby suggest it's the area to the left of the structures which was hit. We don't know what the target was, and there remain doubts about the policy.
The question for me is, do isolated airstrikes help to alleviate the acute humanitarian suffering in Syria, and do they take Syria a single step forward on the road to a long-standing sustainable peace? Airstrikes in the past haven't done that, and nothing I've heard persuades me that these airstrikes are going to do that this time.
International inspectors will spend the coming days determining whether this was a chlorine attack which killed 70 people a week ago, as aid agencies on the ground say it was. But they will not apportion blame. The British, French and American governments have already decided who they hold responsible and hope that this will deter the Assad regime from using chemical weapons again.
Carl, how difficult can the opposition parties make things for Mrs May tomorrow?
Well, I think tomorrow will be a distinctly uncomfortable day for the Prime Minister, not just because of the opposition party. She will be criticised, not only, of course, by those who are opposed to airstrikes under almost any circumstances, but also by those who might have supported her but think that she should either have waited for the international inspectors to go in and do their work, and by those who think she should have come to Parliament to consult them before launching these strikes. Even more awkward will be if the opposition parties manage to engineer some kind of a vote on this later in the week. It would be retrospective, of course, but we know that there are a number of Conservatives who feel uneasy about this kind of action. There were 30 who voted against David Cameron in 2013. But speaking to some of those potential rebels today, I think they see this as a very different case, as a better defined, better planned set of strikes, and crucially, strikes that are now over, of course. And I think that they are not planning to make trouble for the Prime Minister, and that the party will unite around her, that they will give her this one. The big difficulty for Theresa May, of course, is what happens if the Syrian regime does this again.
Carl, thank you.
It is 36 hours since the missiles were aimed at targets in Syria. Today, the diplomatic battle returned to centre stage. The Foreign Secretary says it's been important to show the world that the use of chemical weapons is intolerable. But Boris Johnson admits there's precious little the government can do about the humanitarian disaster that is Syria's 7-year civil war. And as MPs look forward to their chance to question the Prime Minister in the Commons tomorrow, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says he wants a War Powers Act that would see the decision to go to war rest with Parliament and Parliament alone. Here is Simon Israel with the latest.
These pictures are said to be of mission accomplished. The missile strikes on various chemical weapon research and storage facilities in Syria. On the ground, the rubble of buildings gives another impression of destruction, of one site in particular, the Brazza Centre on the outskirts of Damascus. The message may have been to deter the use of chemical weapons, but the government's legal justification for these strikes was to alleviate the overwhelming humanitarian suffering. The Foreign Secretary acknowledged the limitations of intervention.
To be absolutely clear, Assad, who seems to be winning the war, more or less mopping up opposition at this point, can carry on killing people with barrel bombs and machine guns and bombs of all kinds, as long as he doesn't use chemical weapons.
I'm afraid that is the unhappy corollary of this, that if we say that we are limiting our action to chemical weapons, our particular desire to reinforce that prohibition, which is what this is all about, then yes, of course it follows that the rest of the Syrian war must proceed as it will.
The Prime Minister faces Parliament tomorrow. Labour wants to focus on her refusal to consult before the missiles were launched and on what happens next.
A very strong steer to our government to now go back to the UN and promote a resolution and work might and main to bring Russia and the United States together on this so that we do get a political process in Syria, as well, of course, as the removal of chemical weapons. It can be done, it's hard work, and it takes patience, but surely that is better than the danger of escalation of this conflict into a proxy war between the US and Russia over the skies of Syria.
And as if on cue, tonight the US announced it was preparing new sanctions against Russia over its support for President Assad and his alleged use of chemical weapons. It's a development that no doubt will play on MPs' minds when Theresa May delivers her statement tomorrow.
The Prime Minister has done the right thing, in my view. I mean, obviously, I would have preferred, perhaps, if it had gone into Parliament. But, I believe in the royal prerogative. I believe there are instances when the Prime Minister has to make tough decisions. And, of course, she is going to be accountable to Parliament. She's done the right thing here.
The world awaits a response from Russia and Syria to these airstrikes. Diplomacy has yet to restart.
Diplomatically, one of the impacts of the airstrikes will be on the further deterioration of the relationship between Moscow and the West. The arguments over what happened in Duma a week ago and the threats of retaliation by Russia mean that maybe President Trump wasn't exaggerating when he tweeted that the US relationship with Russia is now worse than it has ever been, a sentiment echoed by the head of the United Nations.
The Cold War is back, with a vengeance, but with a difference.
Antonio Gutierrez may well be right. Relations between Russia and the US are, after all, at their lowest ebb in decades. We have yet to hear from President Putin directly, but in a written statement after the strikes, he said they'd had a devastating impact on the whole system of international relations. Washington and Moscow both realized that a direct military confrontation in Syria could quickly spiral.
And I think it's going very well.
What hurts some Russians, especially very rich ones, most are the sanctions recently announced by the US Treasury Department. They've had a severe effect on the coterie closest to the Kremlin and wiped billions off the value of companies owned by Russian oligarchs. From Crimea to Ukraine, Syria, election tampering and now the Salisbury attack, the list of grievances against Russia has grown in recent years. And so has the list of countries prepared to isolate it. President Putin claims the West is ganging up against Russia unfairly. So how comfortable is the West with a strong man in a corner? Well, earlier I spoke to former Russian General Yevgeny Brzezinski. He was closely involved in Russian-NATO relations and is now chairman of the International Non-Proliferation Organization, the PIR Center. I began by asking him if he thought we'll see some military action by Russia in retaliation to the airstrikes in Syria.
Well, first of all, about those strikes, from the military point of view, they were not very significant. Well, I would say even that the last year's strike at Sharat Air Base was more productive. At least the United States managed to damage 4 aircraft, although ready for disposal, but still. This time the strikes were very accurate, just empty buildings, empty depots, and of course they were very cautious not to harm our servicemen and our objects in Syria. That's why there was no need for military retaliation.
So are you now going to prevail upon your Syrian allies to stop using chemical weapons against civilians?
First of all, I trust our people who checked Duma, and they have proof and evidence, witnesses, that was a fake, that was staged. There was a stage episode filmed and presented to the world public opinion as a proof and as a pretext for striking Syria.
Who faked it? Who faked it?
Well, the people, the so-called moderate opposition.
Do you also think that the moon landing was faked?
Oh, well, I don't know. About moon landing, I don't know.
How close, seriously now, how close do you think the world is at the moment to some sort of wider conflict between Russia and the West, if this continues?
If this continues, it's very, very close.
Third World War?
Of course. I repeat that it's an illusion that the military conflict between United States and Russia can be controlled. By the way, Secretary Matthews, if I'm not mistaken, has the same opinion, that conflict between Russia and the United States cannot be controlled completely.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said yesterday, I believe, that this is the Cold War with a vengeance and with a difference. Do you agree with him?
I think that it's worse than the Cold War, which we have been waging for 40 years after the Second World War. You see, in the Cold War time, I was in the armed forces, and I was quite comfortable, I would say. There were definite rules, there were definite red lines. Everybody knew what to do. There were no threats, no sanctions, no isolation, no cornering, no nothing. They were just ideological confrontation, but people on both sides knew how far they could go.
You served in the Soviet military as a general, so let me ask you as a general, do you think it's conceivable, if the current Cold War gets out of hand, that Russia and America and others might face off against each other, even with nuclear weapons?
Of course. I repeat, you cannot control just military confrontation between Russia and the United States. Of course, Russia cannot wage a war with the United States for years. Economically, it cannot. And in the general purpose forces, we are a bit lagging behind the United States. So, and of course, Russia will not accept any kind of defeat. So the involvement of nuclear weapons is inevitable.
Are you trying to scare us, or do you actually mean this?
I'm scared myself, because I have children, I have grandchildren, so I'm scared for their fate.
General Burzynski, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum. Lindsay, you heard him there, the general, the former general. Do you buy that stuff?
Well, I think since we've just had an apocalyptic pessimist, let me try and put another point of view. President Putin presumably wants to retain power. That means not having a war with America, because that would mean his demise. What I think that the Americans, the French and the British will be hoping is that these strikes over the weekend will do something to push the Syrians and the American and the Russians back to the negotiating table over Syria, because everybody is aware that there has to be an end to this war somehow. The Russians don't want to be involved there forever. And of course, there are other issues. The Russians are actually feeling some pressure now because of sanctions. The ruble, the value of the ruble is dropping fast. So it may be possible that President Putin and President Trump might like to step back a little from the brink at this point.
Now, we talk about international brinkmanship in Parliament. What we haven't talked about, really, are the Syrian people.
Yeah.
I mean, they're more affected by this than anyone, of
course.
Has this changed anything for them?
Not really. And the Foreign Secretary pretty much said it, as we saw earlier. Basically, the message this weekend to Bashar al-Assad was, you can carry on killing your own citizens, provided you don't do it with chemical weapons. What happened with the chemical weapons, which all evidence suggests were launched by the government, was that after they fell on the suburb of Douma, the people fled and the rebels surrendered. That is why the government of Syria uses chemical weapons, because they work. Now, most of those people and those rebels have fled to a place called Idlib, which is up towards Turkey. There are many people there, and what they are dreading is the next Russian, Iranian, Syrian assault, because they are now in the eye of the storm. And nothing, I'm afraid, that's happened this weekend will make them think that anybody is coming to save them.
Lindsay Hilsum, thank you very much indeed.